computer. Hello, Kinofreunde, and welcome to the first English episode on this channel, because today my guest is Mariana Rios Maldonado, and she is a Tolkien scholar from the University of Glasgow. Hello, Mariana.
Hi, everybody. Hi, Peter. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Yeah, very much, because we are now 1 week ahead of the start of the Rings of Power, and we're not going to talk so much about this series because I haven't seen anything else but the trailer. But I want to talk about the controversy of the last months. There has been a huge conflict between some say the woke or the progressive fans and the alt-right or the conservative fans about the diversity in Middle-earth. And you, Mariana, you're also an officer for equality and diversity for the Center of Fantasy and the Fantastic. And you became quite a focal point of this heated discussion. I think we're going to talk about that in a minute, but for a start, I would like to know from you, Mariana, what was it that brought you to Tolkien? What sparked your interest in this world?
So that is a very long story.
Okay.
So my father has always been a fan of Tolkien's literary works. So it was basically through him being a Tolkien reader. And then some of you may remember, for example, the Bank and Grass animated movies for The Hobbit and The Return of the King. And then obviously the Ralph Bakshi version of The Lord of the Rings. So it has been sort of like present my entire life, thanks to him, thanks to my dad. And we moved to the United States, to Texas, when I was about a year old, and he was doing his PhD there. So some of the earliest memories that I have is my dad trying for the first time to read Tolkien in English, because so I'm Mexican, he read it first in Spanish, and then trying sort of like to read it in English with a dictionary by his side. So that's sort of like Tolkien has been always present. And later on in life, when we found out, I think we were at the movies watching I think we went to see The Devil's Backbone by Guillermo del Toro. And I remember that there was sort of like the first trailer for The Fellowship of the Ring. And my dad and I just looked at each other, and that was sort of like, I need to read The Lord of the Rings, which until that time, I think I was about 12 or 13 years old. I hadn't read it. And once I read The Lord of the Rings, that just became my favorite book.
Oh, great. And you also chose Tolkien as your field of study and wrote a paper or a thesis about him.
I've actually written 2 theses, and I'm writing my PhD thesis on Tolkien. So when I did my undergraduate or my bachelor studies in Mexico, I did it sort of like an analysis of how basically Tolkien constructs his fantasy or fantastic worlds. Fantasy, fantastic, these are terms that for people in the field, some believe that they are interchangeable, some believe that they are not. So I was using it sort of like in the scholarly understanding in Spanish of what the fantastic, lo fantástico is. How does Tolkien basically fit in, if at all, with that sort of I would say methodological concept. Okay. So that was my bachelor's thesis. And then when I did my master's in Germany. I did my master's at the Freie Universität in comparative literature. And I basically did my dissertation based on a question that one of the great professors at that institution, Andrew James Johnston, if you ever see this, thank you for everything that you've taught me. He had a class on Tolkien, and he prompted the question, why would Tolkien ever want to write, why would he make his most sort of like his magnum opus, why would he make it about the end of an age or the end of a world? And I wrote about so my dissertation was about how Frodo responds to that question. What does Frodo represent in bringing about the end of an age? And that was for my master's thesis. And right now I'm again doing my PhD thesis on Tolkien. So it's been, I would say, over 10 years of Tolkien in some way or another.
Cool. I think that's a nerd's dream to work, to commit your professional life to analyzing Tolkien and writing about him. But usually this kind of stuff isn't the kind of stuff that brings you in a title story of a magazine like Vanity Fair, which is all about fluffy entertainment news. How did it happen? How did it happen that you came in a cover story of Vanity Fair?
So this is my explanation for it, right? As far as I know. So I've been very fortunate that ever since I came to Glasgow, so the Center for Fantasy and the Fantastic was basically, I want to say in German, I'm sorry if I start mixing my languages, this happens very often. So I want to say gegründet. So it was the foundations of the center were laid, I think about in 2019. And ever since then, I've been very fortunate to come into contact with other Tolkien scholars. And there's like a network of all of us. And through this network of Tolkien scholars, I was invited to a couple of, I would say, panels, because after 2019, 2020 comes the pandemic. So a lot of things were happening online. I had the opportunity to present a couple of papers at, for example, the Tolkien Society Oxenmoot, which is the big gathering every fall. And I think from there, I was invited to participate in panels that discussed what had been released, the information that had been released on the upcoming Amazon Prime series. And from then on, I think, so the person who interviewed me from Vanity Fair was Joanne Robinson. And she asked me if I wanted to share with her sort of like my knowledge of Tolkien scholarship, my perspective of Tolkien, and especially considering that, well, it isn't I think there's this general idea that when you think about a Tolkien scholar, you don't necessarily think about a queer woman of color. So that gives you perhaps a different, and especially someone whose first language isn't English. I have a native accent, but I am Mexican first and foremost. My first language is still Spanish. So I think for her and potentially for the people at Vanity Fair, it was interesting to see, especially somebody who was, I'm like new to the field in the sense of I'm still making a name for myself. I am the intersection of all of these multiple identities. And basically what I'm researching isn't from, I don't know, medieval studies or linguistics or what one would traditionally consider sort of like the perspectives from which Tolkien is studied. And I say this on the surface because anybody who knows about Tolkien scholarship knows that the field is super wide, super diverse.
Yes.
So it was, I guess, it depends on how you look at it. I was at the right place at the right time, or at the wrong place at the wrong time.
Yeah. Your quote was it was a very short quote and quite out of context. There was a lot of talk from official Amazon people about how great it would be to have more diverse cast and stuff. And there was a little quote from you, says Mariana, who's not associated with Amazon. She says, oh, there's going to be backlash. And yeah, right there it was. And some of the backlash was aimed at you.
Yes, I think so. What I wanted, so it was I would say there was about an hour interview, right? So from 1 hour interview, it was one sentence, and that sentence. And what my purpose with it was that I knew that there was a lot of controversy already when they announced the cast decisions. And there was a lot of speculation about who would be fitting in certain roles.
Yeah.
And it is something that to this day, I still feel that it was a rhetoric question, but I do think that it's still a valid question, is why would one have this knee-jerk reaction of, I would say, either feeling betrayed or feeling rejection when you see a character that doesn't fulfill sort of like your image of them? And in this case, we're talking about specifically, I think, like probably the most hate was directed towards Ismael Cruz Cordova, who's Puerto Rican, who will play an elf, Arondir, who plays an elf, Arondir. And it's sort of like the question of like, why do you feel that? So elves are imaginary creatures. Why do you feel that an imaginary creature has to look only in a specific way? And if your answer is their skin color should only be of a certain kind, then there's a deeper question there as to how your perception of the world builds into your idea of Tolkien's fictional world, the sources that Tolkien used in order to construct his fictional world, etc., etc. So what I was trying to point out is sort of like having that moment of self-reflection, not so much pointing the finger, but having, you know, the possibility of asking yourself, why are you reacting the way that you're reacting? Why do you feel anger or disgust or etc.? And I think that a lot of people, well, it depends. So I think that there was a certain group of people who were not prepared to ask themselves that sort of question. And I think that once you realize the implications of a question like that, it becomes perhaps a painful task to deconstruct your worldview and what that entails.
Okay.
I think that's on the one hand. I think on the other hand, there's a group of people who very smartly have known how to instrumentalize these type of controversies to fit sort of like in their own sort of, I would say, not only worldview, but in their questioning of ideas such as diversity and feminism, etc., etc. So I think that this was sort of like the perfect moment.
Yeah.
And at the same time, like being perfectly honest, I feel that from many aspects, I kind of embody a lot of the things that these groups of people do not like. I'm queer, I'm Mexican, I'm an immigrant, I know that my picture here looks very white, but let me tell you, that was taken in lockdown and I had not seen the sun for a very long time. So I think that it was just like the perfect sort of like combination of factors so that for a very short period of time, I was sort of like blamed. Also because there was incredible rumors being created on the internet that, for example, I was, I don't know, I was accused of being hired by Amazon with a specific task to make the series woke.
Were you ever hired by Amazon, or did you work on the series?
No! Like, absolutely not. I still live in the same apartment. I've always lived in Glasgow.
Yeah.
If I had been hired by Amazon, first of all, I would have been made to sign an NDA, a non-disclosure agreement.
Yeah.
And a lot of the things that I've commented on, I would have not been able to just for legal reasons. That's one. Two, I'm a PhD student, I'm a tutor, I'm a lot of things, but I've never worked for Amazon. Had I worked for Amazon, you can be sure that I'd be screaming it to the rooftops and I'd have more money, but my bank account is pretty humble still. So no, I have never worked for Amazon, never been contacted by them. I was just in an interview.
Hmm. Yeah, it's right in the text. The Vanity article says does not work for Amazon, but even I, but just cross-reading it the first time, thought, okay, she's the Amazon expert, and because it was such a tiny quote in an interview that was the rest of it was about Amazon people. So it's we people kind of fell into that trap, I think, without anyone wanting to put a blame on you or something like that.
I think there were certain people that, like I said, I think we have to distinguish between the people who had an honest doubt,
Yeah,
and the people who maliciously went out of their way to create and spread a rumor of which they had absolutely no evidence.
yeah.
And the reason why there's no evidence is because it's never happened.
Mhm.
So I think it was sort of like the combination of the two.
Yeah, I think so too. When I type in Rings of Power, the algorithm gives me every day 10 new videos that say, crap. And I mean, nobody has seen an episode, or if they have seen one, they can talk about it. And some people, I don't know, they do this blaming of this show as a way of their living or earning money or something like that, or perhaps to push their own political agenda.
I think it's a combination of the two. I think that, for example, there's something to be said about why is it that the algorithm, for example, shows a predilection or a preference to show these type of videos as opposed to others. So I think there's like, they're formatted in such a way that they are clickbait, but it does generate a lot of views. And for a lot of creators who, I would say some of them outspokenly identify themselves as conservative or alt-right, it represents a form of revenue. So it isn't only that they are purporting a certain point of view, but one also has to understand that they make a living out of this.
Yeah.
And they will monetize it as much as they can. And I feel that it's a perfectly valid position to say, you know what, and here's also like one of the things that needs to be clarified. The fact that I personally or other people have spoken about the importance of expanding our understanding of Tolkien's literary works in who we believe belong there, does not necessarily mean that I think Amazon is this wonderful and great corporation. Like, those are two separate things. And I think it's a valid criticism that, you know, if it wasn't Amazon, it could be Netflix, it could be Paramount, it could be. So I think it's valid criticism to sort of like these mega companies. So these are, for me, these are two issues that converge. And I think it's a perfectly valid position to be skeptic of whatever show, not just the Rings of Power, any show, especially those that are based on literary works. I think you can be skeptic about it. But one thing is to say, you know, the show doesn't seem to be good, won't be good, et cetera, et cetera. And another thing is to say, the reason why this show will not be good is because a Black person is playing a dwarf. So I think that we do have to distinguish sort of like all of the layers and the nuances that are being brought into this conversation.
Is there a way to describe from the text, really from Tolkien's text, are elves or dwarves defined by their skin color? He always says they look fair, but I, as a German, I can't understand if this means they're pale or they're just good looking.
That is the thing. That is the thing. And for example, what you point out has been, I think, a point of discussion for decades now.
Yeah.
So the question is, for example, how would Tolkien use the word fair, especially considering that he's a philologist? So for many people, it is, as you personally described, as either they are pale skinned or they are beautiful. So I don't think we will necessarily reach a definite sort of like decision just because Tolkien isn't around anymore to answer that question for us. That is one thing. The other thing is that, for example, in comparison to elves, when you read about orcs, I was actually reading about it the other day. I believe that one of the first encounters that the Fellowship of the Ring has with orcs is in Moria. And so the bridge of Khazad-dûm, right before they encounter the Balrog. So the Fellowship of the Ring is attacked by a group of orcs. And the description that they give of the orcs is basically that they have dark skin and they are swart. And they have, for example, a red tongue and eyes shining as coals. So one can think, well, how do you interpret swart? As in, and for example, the swartings, does that mean that they have black skin color? Does that mean that they have brown skin? And at the same time, you have a character like Samwise Gamgee, who is described as having brown skin. But we don't necessarily know if that has racial implications, or is it because he's a gardener, he's a worker, and he's tanned.
He's out in the sun.
There's a huge point of discussion of how we're supposed to properly interpret. And at the same time, I would say, sure, we can have conversations around it. And it's important to talk about these things because they may or may not reflect wider systemic issues, not necessarily Tolkien's own position towards race. We have to remember that text as works of art are a reflection of the different forces that are at play within society and within the world. So regardless of an author's intention, things may be expressed in a text that they may not necessarily have intended to in the first place.
Is there a way to say something about the political stance of Professor Tolkien? He was born in South Africa, so he must have known about segregation and apartheid. But he also, in his famous letter to the Nazis, he said, no, I'm not one of you. I don't want to be part of that club. So where can we put the professor politically? Is there a possibility to say, what did he think about diversity?
I think there is a possibility, but we have to be very careful about it. First of all, because what we have from his biography and his letters are curated by different people. So, for example, there's a very famous anthology about his letters, but obviously this is a selection and an edition. We don't have access to all of the letters that he wrote. So what we catch is snippets of Tolkien in time. And through that, we can hypothesize what his position towards certain subjects were. We also have the most famous biography about Tolkien, which was written by Humphrey Carpenter. But at the same time, this is Humphrey Carpenter giving his own view about Tolkien, which Tolkien may or may not have sanctioned, but it's very different to sort of like have that perspective from, you know, a third person's perspective. So that, now you mentioned, for example, the letter that he wrote, it was in regards to the German edition of The Hobbit, where they asked if he was of Aryan descent. And he basically told them, you know, in more or less politely, it's none of your business, bye-bye. Exactly. But at the same time, for example, when he was describing orcs in his same collection of letters, he uses words that have racial connotations, like Mongoloid, that we have now understand that. And for example, Dr. Dimitra Fimi has a wonderful text on Tolkien and race and cultural history, where she basically explains the history of this terminology, why Tolkien was using it, and why it was common parlance of the time.
Yeah.
So, but at the same time, it's a very dangerous argument to say, oh, but Tolkien was only reflecting the views that were popular during his lifetime, because there's a series of other authors that were also, I don't know, English, British, European, that didn't necessarily express themselves that way, that did not agree with these ideologies. So, and they're still people of that time.
Yeah.
If that makes any sense. So I think, and also, like, I'm sorry if this is like going sort of like and, but it's a very complex issue.
Yeah, but the thing is, you can't put the finger on. He never said all elves are shiny whitey white.
Exactly. And there will come a point in time where I think that even if he had said it, which adaptations allow us to basically say, we acknowledge the author's intention, but we are going to take this text and the way that we perceive it and the way that the world today responds to it is thus. So that's the other thing.
Yeah. I think adaptations always alter the material. I mean, Peter Jackson never has that relationship of master and servant between Sam and Frodo. They are just friends, and nobody complains about it because it works so much more for our sensitivity, I think. So it's not a bad thing to adapt and modernize.
No, and I think that's the other thing. Like, people, like, in a lot of the conversations that I've seen online, people don't realize how much Peter Jackson modified a lot of the content in Lord of the Rings precisely in order to, cater to contemporary audiences, to make sort of like, to meet the expectations of film studios, et cetera, et cetera. Just for example, the relationship between Denethor and Faramir is different. Faramir is very different in the text.
Aragorn is different,
for example, the role that Arwen plays, that's probably one of the most obvious ones. There is no Tom Bombadil, which a lot of the people who love the books decry. I like Tom Bombadil. I'm team Tom Bombadil. I know some people hate him. I really like him. So I think it would also be sort of like, if we were to ask what Tolkien would have thought about diversity, we don't know. And to try to speculate and sort of like, I think it would be important, and it's a valuable exercise to try to understand maybe how Tolkien would have reacted to today's world. Like, imagine if Tolkien had Twitter. It is a valuable exercise, but I do think that the value that is placed on what he would have wanted, what he would have said, it says more about us, about our wishes, our intentions, our worldview, than about Tolkien himself. Because again, he's no longer here to tell us.
But I think I have this, I feel this defensive vibe for Tolkien when I see, for example, he said explicitly dwarves have beards, male and female alike. And then one of the first images we get is a female dwarf without a beard. And I think, okay, this is directly against what the author wrote and doesn't make it any better or more diverse or anything.
I will be completely honest. I think for me, there are larger issues at play than dwarves' beards. And I say this with the utmost respect, in the sense of, I think that it is an important detail, but again, this is one of the details that we only have and that we're going on. And so how much value are we going to place on that specific sort of like point of attention, since we don't know, for example, how the rest of the story is going to develop.
Yeah.
So I think it's a question of balance. It's a question of seeing everything sort of like in its right proportion. And also, for example, this brings about a question about when you say defending Tolkien and feeling defensive. To me, that is very strongly linked to what we consider to be the spirit of the text.
Yeah.
What do you consider to be the spirit of Lord of the Rings, of Middle Earth, etc.? And so I believe that it's a valuable conversation to have it about, okay, so should we take the author's words literally? How much wiggle room do we have to adapt in terms of appearance, in terms of, I don't know, appearance, gender, etc.? And how that affects the whole.
I think the whole color thing, for me, it really doesn't change much. If there are wood elves, let them wood elves have different colors than the high elves. Who cares if they're good written? But I think, like you said, with gender issues, if you put in a queer character, I think Tolkien was such a Catholic author. He even made male and female trees. So he was the most binary author you can think of. So if you start inserting gender fluid characters or whatever, I think that would go against what I imagine the spirit of Tolkien.
That is a really interesting sort of like conversation also because, for example, so I'm thinking about the relationship between Frodo and Sam, who has been also this relationship that has been read as queer, and queer doesn't necessarily entail that it involves a homosexual sexual relationship. It has to do, for example, with the proximity and the intimacy of two male characters. And I think that as much as Tolkien could have been a Catholic, and it was never his intention for Frodo and Sam to develop a queer relationship, I think that it is a valid interpretation just because we see the way in which both of these characters develop that sense of proximity and trust. And I know that there are people that disagree. If I'm not mistaken, for example, Corey Olsen, who's a Tolkien professor, is against this type of reading. And I find that perfectly respectable. I also think that when it comes, for example, to Tolkien's understanding of religion and his own personal stance, he was very good friends with W.H. Auden, who was an openly homosexual writer. So I do think that there is sort of like, with this, I'm not trying to say that he has fluid characters or he would have like inserted non-binary characters. But what I'm trying to say is that Tolkien is potentially much more complex and had relationships with people in the world who were openly gay, as opposed to sort of like this monolithic Catholic religious stance. So people are much more complex than that.
It probably wouldn't,
No. And I think, for example, I'm not, I have to admit, like every Tolkien scholar has sort of like their own, what's it called? Their own expertise. Right. So my level of expertise is primarily on The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. I think that, for example, there has been queer studies elaborated on Elvish characters in the Silmarillion. I might be mistaken, but that's something to look into because queer studies is part of Tolkien scholarship and has been for at least 20 years or so. So
I think the professor's work is so open and has so many layers that's why different parties try to grab and utilize it, from the Nazis to the hippies to now the alt-right tries to catch him and the progressive left tries to bring him into their respective camps. But I think his world is Middle Earth. It's not this world of the 21st century.
Oh, I completely agree in that sense. I think that that's what we have to distinguish also, again, is like how we interpret and how we perceive the text and the way that it's, and the world that is created within the text, and how we are basically projecting our own set of values, of hopes, of wishes, of interpretations. I think the problem comes about when anybody takes a dictatorial stance and says, this is the one and only meaning that forever will be valid. Because we don't know what future generations will find in Tolkien and how they will read it and how they will make it relatable to their own world. And that's also another reason why Tolkien is such a fascinating author. It's like the fact that you have people from, these extreme political positions finding value in a fictional world is amazing, is astounding. And that speaks to like, what? The Lord of the Rings was first published in 1954, 1955. We are well over 50 years after, and it's still something to talk about.
Yeah. And I think going back to Amazon, it says they are working for diversity and have put this very, very upfront, saying, now here's the diversity version of Tolkien. Do you think they are sincere in this? Are they really saying, okay, has to be a better world, or are they just checking their boxes because that's the stuff that sells right now?
I think that that's a very valid question. And I would also say that it depends on who you ask this to. Because, for example, we won't know if them including people of color in Middle Earth is an act of like, will these characters have significant weight and significant roles within the show? Or is it an act of tokenism, of performative wokeness? We won't know until we see the series.
Performative wokeness, that's good.
Yeah. And I think it is a risk when it comes to, for example, these big production companies.
Yeah.
And it is important to talk about it. And I'm also saying this as a person of color. What I also think is that, for example, if you ask me about representation, my answer about the importance of representation will perhaps be completely different to that of, I have to say it, of a white person who's accustomed to see themselves in certain spaces, in certain worlds. So the fact is that people of color have read Tolkien, have created fan fiction and fan art, and since The Lord of the Rings was published. So the fact that now there is this potential, the possibility of not only us finding that sort of, joy and that sort of engagement with, mass media products that are inspired in those texts, to see yourself reflected in that world, to know that, for example, like in my case, the fact that I see Ismael Cruz Cordova, and when I hear him talk in Spanish and know that he's Latin American, that for me brings me a lot of joy.
Yeah.
That I don't know if other people may understand that. And I will wait and see, for example, exactly what his storyline is about, how he acts, like how good his acting is, et cetera, et cetera. Of course, we'll know in a couple of weeks, in a couple of days. But the fact that there's already that precedent of, finally they're saying, yes, like you too are part of this world. We've always read this world. We've always seen this world. We've always there are elements there that bring us a lot of joy that we find we need to critique, that for some people are painful. And now we are at that point where, yes, there is that participation, there is that representation. And I don't necessarily expect that perhaps other people that are not people of color understand that.
Yeah, I can understand. It's this good feeling, this warm feeling to see, that's me, something like that, huh?
And I read I've read and heard a lot of the argument, for example, of people saying, well, it's a fictional world and like one shouldn't be so invested in character descriptions. Like fiction allows you to always see yourself somewhere. And I think that
Yes.
argument is very valid if you're used to seeing yourself on TV and in the movies and in fantasy worlds, etc.
In a book, you can imagine the heroes to look like you. That's no problem. But once you do a movie, you have to put a face to it, and most of the time they put the faces they have. If there was a South Korean version, everybody would look South Korean, and
but that's the complexity of the issue. The complexity of the issue is that, for example, there is like you just said, there is that argument of like you can imagine the characters looking like you, but there is accounts of so many people who, as people of color, as Black readers, as Indigenous readers, read Tolkien and say, I don't see myself there. I never imagined that I would be able to participate in this, you know?
In a book?
For example,
okay.
there is a very beautiful novel by a Puerto Rican author called Junot Diaz. That's The Brief and Wondrous Life of Oscar Wilde, which I highly recommend for people if they are interested in fantasy. And the main character, Oscar, he's also Puerto Rican and he loves Tolkien. And basically his relationship to Tolkien, his relationship to fictional works describes a lot of sort of like the difficulties, the joy, and also the pain that it is, for example, for immigrant readers and people of color, when you read the descriptions of evil, quote unquote, evil characters like the Southrons and the Easterlings.
Okay.
Or you read about orcs that have dark skin, and then you look at yourself and you think,
oh, that's me.
Well, why, you know, like, it would seem that in this world, I would only be, like, if I were in this world, I would only be destined to be the antagonist, the monstrous other, the foe.
I completely understand. I'm from Germany, and the images of Germans in the last 50 years were the evil Nazi, and that was our role for a long time in every movie. And yeah.
So it's a very sort of like complex question that I would actually ask people to, instead of like trying to center yourself and your reaction to the text and your experience, to listen to the people that have had other set of feelings and other experiences that are different to yours. The same text can produce these different types of meaning, and they are still valid.
But there is still a quality in mine. If I look at Akira or Ghost in the Shower, I still can identify with the persons, even I'm not a Japanese cartoon.
Yeah, no, and I think, for example, that happens when we see now a lot of, for example, cosplayers who are people of color who, you know, identify themselves as, I don't know, soldiers of Gondor or elves, or like are able to sort of like take it that step further. I personally, the way that sort of like my brain works, I never necessarily felt that I identified with one single character throughout my lifetime. So, and at the same time, it's like, well, I'm short and I'm Mexican. Surely I'm a hobbit. I love to eat and I like to party. So surely I'm that, you know? And there's also, for example, if you look in the internet, there's beautiful examples of people sort of like reinterpreting and adapting Tolkien's work to different sort of like traditional art styles. Like, for example, artwork that places Middle Earth as in, I don't know, I'm sorry if I don't know the technical terms, so I'm going to be sort of like very basic when describing this, but the members of the Fellowship of the Ring depicted in traditional Japanese art styles. And that's amazing, and that's beautiful, and that's wonderful. And it reimagines them sort of like as a, I would say, as a beautiful type of response to say, you know what, these are the other interpretative possibilities. And there's this visual element. So, and that's just one example of how already Tolkien's like, people think that the diversity that we now see in the show is sort of like, you know, hasn't existed elsewhere. No, it's been going on for a very long time. It's a conversation that has been happening in other circles, but now the Amazon show brings it to the forefront in the sense of it's this multi-million-dollar production. And it's going to be in your TV set every week.
I get this, my cynical look, because I don't believe that Amazon does this because they want to make a better and more diverse world. Because if they want, they could have taken Earthsea, which has people of color, or they could have taken any novel by Marion Zimmer Bradley, who has feminism in their DNA. Instead, they take Tolkien, which is not that diverse to begin with. They are, I don't know, I think they're trying to sell something and not.
Of course they're trying to sell something. Of course, like when you see, for example, how the premieres are coming about and sort of like everything that is so bombastic and spectacular, like they want this to be a hit. And
it has to be.
And
expensive.
yeah, and to this day, I think that it is also, for example, we could also talk about you know, how Tolkien has been made sort of like this idea that Tolkien is the father of modern fantasy, and publications, publishing houses have basically run with it, sort of like the publishing industry, in the sense that he's everywhere and his works are everywhere. So that is, I would say, for a lot of people, is sort of like a guarantee of a certain amount of income, of a certain amount of success. Like, he's already so popular and so pervasive. If we make a show about Middle Earth, then most likely we will get, you know, our investment back. And this is to say also that there are thousands and thousands of other fantasy works, like you've already mentioned Ursula K. Le Guin, right? There's so many other authors in the fantasy realm that you could also make wonderful and successful adaptations.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, sort of like Tolkien has this privileged position that, in my mind, obviously attracts a production company such as like an enterprise such as Amazon to say, this surely will be a hit and make millions of dollars for us, if that makes any sense. So it's not just that there's a good story behind it and there's quality behind the story. Like, what I'm trying to say here is that Amazon is not dumb.
No,
they know what they're doing.
No, they're not. And I think their campaign was so focused on diversity. I think Amazon is the winner. If one grinds out a hate video every day, Amazon says, cool, go on, do more, because it's merchandising or promotion without payment.
And then you have to ask yourself, like, no, I completely agree. And I think at that point, like, you have to ask yourself, for example, Amazon will always win because people, even the people that say, I'm not going to watch the show, you're probably going to watch the show. You've already watched on YouTube a lot of things that are related to the show. But you also have to think, for example, I don't know, who are the people that have to, you know, sacrifice things in order to make this happen? And I think about the horrible position that the actors have been placed in, you know, having to receive I only experienced trolling and hate online for a couple of months. And every so often I find somebody sends an email to me saying something that whatever. Like I've only experienced a fraction of what the actors have had to put up with, for the simple fact that they are participating in, a production that's based on Tolkien's works, and they're not white. And I feel that to me is, I cannot seem to justify how people would be willing to send so much hate that way. So, and at the end of the day, I'm probably sure that there are mechanisms in place to be able to protect them. I'm sure that they know, or they were made aware of the implications. But at the same time, it must be so difficult to handle that on a daily basis.
Did you feel protected? They put you on the line too in that article.
So I would say that, for example, Vanity Fair, when I spoke out, and so, okay, my first reaction when this all happened, so I have a very sort of like feisty spirit, and my reaction is like, I know that you're not supposed to feed the trolls, but I felt compelled to answer because it was my name on the line and people were lying about me. But then I realized that I didn't have enough time and energy to deal with all of this with such negativity, especially when you're having I don't know, private messages day and night coming in through Twitter or Instagram with any sort of variation between, I don't know, you've ruined Tolkien's work. And I'm like, how? You've ruined Tolkien's legacy. You should be ashamed of yourself, to the extreme of, we're going to come and get you. And that was just I'm just phrasing this in a very sort of light way.
I understand.
So when Joanna Robinson and Vanity Fair found out what I was experiencing, they were the first to sort of change the online article to make it absolutely crystal clear that I had nothing to do with the sort of with the production. Sort of that I was never hired, that I did not work for Amazon, that I was consulted in a completely independent way. But this was a couple of, I would say 1 or 2 weeks later. And I was also very naive and very inexperienced. I've had a crash course in how to deal with these things. And that's why, for example, right now, you can see a nice picture of me, but I'm very aware of the way, because it has happened to me before. I have had these YouTube channels manipulate my image and manipulate things, taking things that I say out of context to create their own sort of set of videos. So I have to be careful with that. My Twitter is on private, and until I finish my PhD, it's going to remain on private because I don't have time and nobody's paying me to put up with this. So my Instagram is private, etc. And I would say I've found a lot of support from the community of Tolkien scholars. I found a lot of support, obviously, in the University of Glasgow was very, especially the Center for Fantasy and the Fantastic. They really sort of supported me in that sense. But I also feel that what was very helpful for me at the time was to realize that there is a difference between the real world, the tangible world of you go outside and you see a tree and there's a bird and you stepped on a piece of gum and somebody honks a car. That is real. And then there's this online space like Twitter, where it's just people talking about things and shouting at each other. And it's differentiating those two realms for me was vital. And in that sense, Amazon has sort of like, they did reach out and they offer sort of like, okay, so is there anything that we can do for you moving forward? But in the sense of, protective mechanisms of your social media, etc. But at the same time, like what I'm very clear that I'm not an influencer. I have no intention of being a YouTube content creator. I'm just a scholar. Yeah. So the way that I contribute to the world is, for example, when I talk to you about ideas and my perspective, when I write articles, when I write my PhD thesis, like that for me is what I want to focus myself on. So if I only have a couple of followers on Twitter, that's fine. If I only have, like my Facebook page, I have it because people in Mexico still use Facebook. And that's the way that I talk to my friends there. So I would say that fortunately, I perceive myself on the world in such a way that I've learned and I'm now guarded. And yes, it was a very difficult experience. And sometimes I feel like I have to be super careful about the things that I do or say. But it is important to continue talking about these things. And yeah. I'm at least in a position where I'm in a very privileged position where I can still speak freely, where I don't feel intimidated. I feel cautious, but I haven't changed my mind about, the core aspect of whatever happened in the beginning, which is basically that, in a nutshell, I think that people of color find joy in Tolkien's works, and that isn't going to stop. That is sort of like the main thing. And I hope for the people that are ready to receive that message and engage with that message, great. If there's people that feel, offended or disgusted by it, you know what? Peace, namaste. What else can you do?
Yeah. Okay.
And wherever you see hate, stomp it out. Like, we can have a discussion. I'm not here to have hate.
Yeah. I think it's very, we can disagree, but it's harassing people online or in real life. No.
Especially because we're talking about a fictional world where trees
talk. A fictional world, but which plays by totally different rules than ours and has, yeah. Well, we talked about an hour now. I would say thank you very much, Mariana, and for joining me. It was a very, very interesting conversation and peaceful and without hate. And I hope we're gonna. Are you gonna watch the show? Rings of Power? Or I say, nah.
You know what? Like, I've thought about that lately. In the beginning, I was like, I can't be bothered. Like, there has been so much going around it that I feel like I'm not psychologically prepared, because like, I think it is a real concern. Like, what if, for example, I see people of color, and what if they're not giving a great storyline? What if, like all of these things, or I don't know, what if I go to a public viewing and there's people that, react in a certain way and are trolls in real life? But the other day, and I'm going to keep saying his name, praising him, because I think he's just an amazing actor and human being. The other day I saw an interview with Ismael Cruz Cordova, where he was talking in Spanish about how much it had meant for him to be in the production as the first Latino, as a Spanish speaker, as how he felt when he first watched The Lord of the Rings, the Peter Jackson movies, how he felt like, I want to be part of this world, but I don't know if I belong. Yeah. And now I belong. And listening to the way that he basically, very organically took that experience and expressed it with such clarity, so articulate, but at the same time very much from the heart. It's like, you know what, I think I'll give it a try. I'll give it a chance.
Okay, then thank you very much, and I hope you have a good time and stay healthy. Maybe it's going to be bad fan fiction, maybe it's going to be good fan fiction, but the world of Tolkien will stay with us for a long time.
And maybe it's like that type of bad fan fiction that it's like, it's so bad, it's good.
Yeah, maybe.
You never know. You never know.
No, we don't know.
Thank you so much, Peter, for having me. It has been great talking to you. I think that you pose a lot of insightful questions. And like, I think for me, what you said about, you know, the power that Amazon has as a company and being skeptical, like, I think that has value in itself too. And I'm very grateful to have the opportunities to talk about that a little bit more in depth. And I wish you all the best for you and your channel and your viewers.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
And